June 1942. The North African desert breathes heat and silence. The sun hangs low, burning everything gold and gray. A single British anti-tank gun sits half buried in the sand, its barrel dark with dust. Around it, the world trembles under the distant growl of engines. German Panzers, 9 of them, crawl over the dunes like metal beasts, their tracks slicing through the emptiness. Inside a shallow pit beside the gun, a lone British gunner watches through the shimmer of heat. His water canteen is empty, his crew is gone. The sand presses against his lips as he waits. Every movement could mean death. A breeze rises, gentle at first, then strong. The desert floor begins to lift in tiny spirals. The gunner's eyes narrow. The dust could hide him. He lowers his head, grips the firing lever, and pulls. A shell screams into the open, not at the enemy, but into the sand. A towering cloud explodes upward, swallowing him whole. Within that storm of dust, he disappears. The Germans see nothing, and the deception begins. The North African desert in 1942 was more than a battlefield. It was an ocean of heat, dust, and death, a place where the smallest movement could betray a soldier's position and the faintest shimmer could disguise a tank. Between the burning ridges of Libya and Egypt, the British 8th Army and the German Afrika Korps clashed in one of the most unforgiving environments of World War II. By the summer of that year, the campaign had reached a brutal balance. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had driven deep toward Egypt after a string of victories. His panzer divisions moved like waves, fast and disciplined, striking before the enemy could react. Against him stood the British 8th Army, composed of British, Indian, Australian, and South African troops, men hardened by sand and struggle, yet worn by retreat. The desert offered no shelter, no trees, no beachbars, wildings, no shade. The wind itself carried both life and death. Dust could blind aircraft, choke engines, and hide entire battalions. Soldiers learned to fight not just the enemy, but the terrain itself. For the gunners, those who faced tanks with nothing but small cannons and their nerve, the desert was both a trap and a weapon. British anti-tank units in 1942 were often equipped with the Ordnance QF 2-pounder, later replaced by the 6-pounder, both modest in size compared to German armor. The 2-pounder could penetrate early Panzer III armor, but as the war evolved, it became nearly obsolete. Yet the men who manned them remained fearless. They operated close to the front, camouflaged with sand and netting, knowing that once they fired, they would be seen and destroyed within seconds. Reports from the Gazala line, a defensive stretch west of Tobruk, tell of gunners who lasted only minutes once they opened fire. The Panzer divisions, moving with perfect coordination, could fix a gun's location almost instantly. Counterfire followed in waves. A single muzzle flash in the desert was enough to invite a rain of shells. But the desert had its own rules. The light changed by the hour. Mirage ripples bent the air. The same sand that betrayed a man's position could also hide him if he knew how to use it. That was the secret that separated survival from annihilation. In late May and early June, as the Battle of Gazala raged, British units found themselves under relentless assault. The Germans had executed a sweeping flank maneuver, the so-called right hook, that threatened to collapse the entire British line. Anti-tank crews were scattered, isolated, and forced to adapt. Many dug in near shallow wadis or ridgelines, concealing their guns beneath camouflage nets or broken rock. Among them were gunners from the Royal Artillery's 7th Anti-Tank Regiment, assigned to cover approaches near Bir Hakeim and Knightsbridge, names that would soon become synonymous with courage and loss. It was within this chaos that stories emerged of individual acts of defiance, men who refused to retreat even when surrounded. The dust cloud tactic would later be remembered as one of the most inventive battlefield deceptions in the Desert War. It was born not from manuals or orders, but from instinct, from a gunner's desperate understanding of how the land itself could become his ally. He had seen how tank shells striking the sand raised enormous veils of dust, obscuring vision for seconds at a time. He understood how wind direction and light angle could make that veil almost impenetrable. And so, instead of using his gun solely as a weapon, he used it as a tool of confusion. Each pull of the trigger created chaos, not just for the enemy, but for the air itself. Within moments, the gunner could shift position, re-aim, and strike from an entirely different angle. while the Germans fired blindly at the spot he had just left. It was an act of pure battlefield intelligence born from the most primitive of material: sand, wind, and willpower. And as Rommel's tanks advanced across the dunes, such acts began to turn the tide of survival itself. To understand how a single gunner's deception could destroy 9 panzers, one must first understand the scale of the machine he faced. The German Panzer divisions of 1942 were a force of precision. The 15th and 21st Panzer divisions under General Kruel and General von Bismarck operated like synchronized steel predators. Their tanks, mainly Panzer III and Panzer IV variants, were fast, heavily armored, and supported by mobile artillery and Luftwaffe reconnaissance. They moved with intent, rarely halting, probing weak points in the British lines. When they found an anti-tank position, they coordinated instantly. Smoke rounds, flanking moves, and suppressive fire. Against such efficiency, a single British gun crew's chance of survival was thin. The Battle of Gazala, fought between May 26 and June 21, 1942, became the crucible of desert tactics. British defensive boxes, small fortified positions, were meant to resist encirclement, but Rommel's maneuver warfare made them vulnerable. Once surrounded, these strong points became islands of resistance amid a sea of enemy armor. For the anti-tank gunners, every engagement was a test of nerve. They could not move quickly. The guns weighed over 1,000 kilograms and required steady hands to aim. When the panzers advanced, their only defense was concealment, a fragile illusion that often lasted seconds. The desert's dust played strange games with sight. A column of tanks on the move threw up plumes visible for miles, but the fine particles also refracted light, hiding precise distances. Mirage effects could make tanks appear to float or vanish entirely. British crews soon realized they could use this to their advantage. As the Gazala line began to crumble, several British units were forced to operate independently. Supply lines broke down, ammunition dwindled, air cover became rare. In such isolation, improvisation became survival. Some gunners used burning fuel drums to simulate destroyed positions. Others scattered spare helmets and cloth to trick Luftwaffe pilots into overflying empty ground. But one man took deception further, turning nature itself into a weapon. He understood something crucial. German tank optics relied on contrast. The gunners and commanders inside panzers looked for defined outlines, flashes, or movement. A clean, sharp silhouette was death for anyone manning a gun. But in the swirling haze of dust, those outlines disappeared. British field manuals did not teach this. It was not standard procedure. It was instinct. The unnamed gunner, stationed near the crumbling edge of the British defensive zone, had seen enough engagements to know that the desert punished visibility. His weapon, likely a 6-pounder QF gun, was set in a shallow depression. Around him, the sand rose in uneven dunes, perfect for reflection, concealment, and trickery. When the German column approached, he had already been firing sporadically, marking his position in enemy eyes. His gun was hot and his hand, blistered. But as shells began to fall closer, he noticed how each explosion raised immense clouds that hung in the wind, cutting off sightlines completely. That was the moment of realization. If dust could blind the enemy, then dust could save him. He began to fire short bursts, not at tanks, but into the sand ridge ahead of him. The shockwaves created pillars of drifting earth, merging into a thick screen. Through that haze, the Germans assumed the position had been hit, or abandoned. They fired again, overshooting the target, confident they had silenced the British gun. But he was still there, crawling, dragging his weapon by hand to a slightly new angle. Inch by inch, he realigned his aim through the veil. Moments later, the first German tank rolled directly into his new sightline. He fired once. The shell struck the Panzer's side armor, igniting its fuel. The explosion raised another wall of dust. The storm built itself. Each kill created more cover. Each shot deepened the illusion. And within that mirage of smoke and sand, one man rewrote the rules of desert warfare. The desert was both his enemy and his ally. For most soldiers, its blinding glare and endless dust brought exhaustion, thirst, and despair. But for this lone gunner, it became the perfect accomplice. In every account of North Africa, the human struggle is constant. The unbearable heat, the sting of sand in every breath, the long silences before battle. A man alone at an anti-tank gun faced not only machines but his own breaking point. The air shimmered, ammunition ran low, and water was rationed to sips. Yet under those conditions, clarity sometimes came, not in fear but in a sharpened calm. That calm was survival. The gunner's focus narrowed until the entire desert reduced to sound, motion, and timing. His pulse slowed, each shot became measured. He wasn't just fighting tanks, he was fighting chaos and somehow mastering it. In desert warfare, movement meant death. Once a gun fired, its position was compromised. Repositioning under enemy eyes was unthinkable. German optics and coordination made it nearly suicidal. But the dust cloud deception broke this logic. By deliberately generating a veil of sand, the gunner inverted the battlefield's natural order. The enemy's strength, their sight, became useless. The more they fired, the thicker the haze became. The tactic turned visibility into a weapon. For the first time, the open desert, long considered an anti-tank gunner's death trap, became a labyrinth of illusions. Under the swirling fog of dust, angles shifted, sounds echoed differently, and the Germans could no longer track origin points. It was a one-man smokescreen, improvised and deadly effective. This was not luck. It was tactical awareness at its highest. The understanding that deception, not firepower, determined survival. In the desert's logic, those who could see were blind, and those who vanished could strike at will. As the dust swirled higher and German tank commanders scanned in vain, the stage was set for something no one could have predicted: the systematic destruction of an armored column by a gunner they believed was already dead. The British anti-tank gun was modest compared to German armor. The 6-pounder QF gun could penetrate early Panzer III and IV armor, but its limitations were clear. It had no automatic loader, limited traverse, and required careful aiming. Each shell was precious. Against a coordinated Panzer assault, gunners were often outgunned and outnumbered. Yet technology alone did not decide the fight. The gunner's skill turned a basic weapon into a lethal instrument. By using dust as a shield, he created opportunities his weapon's raw power could exploit fully. Precision, timing, and positioning mattered more than caliber. German Panzer commanders relied heavily on sight and movement. Their strategy emphasized reconnaissance and coordination. A single gun's location could be identified by muzzle flash or dust from fired shells. The desert's emptiness worked in both directions, but here, deception neutralized it. As the gunner created clouds of dust, German crews became uncertain, hesitant, and eventually reckless. They fired into phantom targets. Their formation fragmented, their advance slowed. Chaos replaced confidence. At higher levels, officers like Rommel prized initiative and adaptability. Yet even he acknowledged the limits of command when facing unpredictable factors. In the desert, one man's ingenuity could ripple through an entire operation. The gunner's dust cloud was a tactical anomaly, impossible to plan for, yet profoundly effective. It demonstrated how decentralized decision-making, individual skill and judgment, could alter outcomes in ways top-down orders could not. Desert warfare imposed a harsh calculus. Every shell, every shot, decided life or death. Yet the gunner's method, though lethal, relied on stealth and cunning rather than sheer destruction. It was a war of survival, not glory. By turning nature against the enemy, he avoided exposure and minimized unnecessary risk to himself while still achieving strategic impact. The act itself was as much about intelligence as it was about courage. In these angles, human endurance, tactical innovation, technological understanding, enemy psychology, leadership insight, and moral navigation, the story of the gunner becomes more than a battlefield anecdote. It becomes a study in how war rewards observation, patience, and creativity. The sun dipped low over the desert horizon, casting long shadows across the dunes. The British gunner had already fired into the sand multiple times, each explosion sending clouds of dust spiraling into the sky. The Germans, 9 Panzers strong, advanced slowly, their engines growling like beasts in the dying light. To their eyes, the gunner's position seemed compromised, perhaps destroyed, but he remained, hidden in the haze, every sense tuned to survival. He had learned the rhythm of the battlefield, the time it took for dust to rise, drift, and settle. With each shell, he measured wind direction, adjusting the gun slightly before every movement. The gun was heavy, cumbersome, yet he maneuvered it with precision, sliding it just enough to line up the first real shot. His hands were blistered, his eyes stinging from sand and smoke, but his mind was razor-sharp. The 1st Panzer, a Panzer III Ossifen M, crested a ridge, unaware of the danger. The gunner fire. The shell struck the tank's side, tearing through its armor and igniting the engine. Flames erupted, smoke joining the dust in a chaotic curtain. German crews further down the line assumed the gunner had been destroyed. They adjusted formation, seeking an unobstructed path, unaware of the lethal observer hidden in the storm of sand. The gunner used this brief window to reposition. He slid the gun 20 meters to the left, ducking behind a low ridge as another dust plume enveloped him. Each move was calculated, each second counted. The Germans fired blindly at the original position, wasting shells and exposing their vulnerability. A second Panzer approached, this time a Panzer IV F2. He waited, breathing slowly, timing the roll of its treads over the shifting sand. The shot was precise. The shell struck the turret, detonating ammunition inside. Another fireball, another shroud of dust and smoke. The gunner's pulse was steady. He had learned the rhythm: attack, reposition, wait. The 3rd and 4th Panzers entered the trap almost simultaneously. From the German perspective, their line of advance was intact. From the British gunner's perspective, it was a moving canvas. Each vehicle that appeared through the dust was struck with exacting timing. He exploited the confusion, knowing that every explosion added to the chaos, masking his next position. By now, the dust had become a full curtain. The desert air shimmered with sand and heat, making it impossible to see more than a few meters ahead. German commanders radioed for recon, but communication lagged. Each attempt to correct formation only worsened the chaos. The gunner's technique was simple yet devastating: create false openings, mislead enemy perception, and strike from concealment. He fired shell after shell, each time to coincide with shifting clouds of sand, until the 5th, 6th, and 7th Panzers had fallen. By now, the Germans were disoriented. Their advance slowed. Hesitation replaced confidence. In the fleeting moments between attacks, the gunner could see the scale of his impact. Tanks that had seemed invincible now lay in ruin, their metal hulks silhouetted against the burning horizon, dust and smoke intertwined, hiding the precise origin of destruction. As night approached, he prepared for the final sequence. The last 2 Panzers advanced cautiously, unaware that their fate had already been sealed by the ingenuity of a single man who had mastered his environment, weapon, and the psychology of his enemy. And as the stars began to pierce the twilight sky, the gunner fired again, unseen and unstoppable. The desert night began to fall, painting the dunes in muted grays and shadows. The dust and smoke still hung thick over the battlefield, obscuring the wreckage of 7 Panzers. The gunner, barely visible even to himself, was already preparing for the final engagement. His position, hidden behind a low ridge and partially camouflaged by disturbed sand, offered just enough cover to strike again. Every movement was deliberate, every breath measured. 2 Panzer IVs, the last of the enemy column, approached cautiously. German crews scanned the horizon, confused by the trail of destruction and the shifting clouds of dust. They had radioed back, trying to see ordinate flanking maneuvers, but the desert's haze frustrated their communication. To the gunner, this was a perfect moment. They were confident, yet disoriented, exposed, yet blind. He fired at the first tank, aiming for the side armor near the fuel compartment. The shell struck true, erupting in a massive fireball that illuminated the desert like lightning. The 2nd Panzer halted, attempting to reverse, but the gunner's aim was already realigned. Another shot tore through its side, sending it rolling down a dune in a cascade of fire and metal. Silence followed for a heartbeat, then the sounds of chaos from the surviving German crew. By now, the gunner's repeated repositioning within the dust cloud had made him virtually invisible. Each explosion, each fireball provided a fresh curtain, allowing him to shift the gun, check the wind, and calculate the next shot. The desert, hostile and unforgiving, had become his ally, a moving screen of sand, smoke, and heat shimmer. He paused briefly, scanning the battlefield. 9 Panzers destroyed, each a calculated target, each a demonstration of skill and patience. The Germans, shaken and bewildered, could only attempt to regroup. Their confidence had been shattered. Radio reports would later describe confusion at every level of command. Rommel himself relied on reconnaissance to adjust maneuvers, but in this microcosm, one gunner had upended the order of battle. The final act was as much psychological as it was tactical. The survivors reported phantom shots from different angles, mistaking the gunner for multiple positions. His use of dust, fire, and timing created the illusion of a widespread anti-tank network. Fear spread faster than the sandstorm itself, slowing their advance and sowing uncertainty. Eventually, the gunner withdrew under the cover of darkness, his task complete. The desert was littered with twisted metal and smoke, silent testimony to the precision and audacity of a single operator. By exploiting the environment, manipulating perception, and striking decisively, he had achieved what conventional strategy deemed nearly impossible. This event, though isolated in time, illustrated a fundamental truth of warfare. Technology alone does not guarantee victory. Skill, creativity, and understanding of one's environment often surpass numerical superiority. One man, using dust as both shield and weapon, had rewritten the rules for desert combat. The night settled over the dunes. Flames from destroyed tanks still flickered in the distance, a grim beacon of survival and ingenuity. The gunner, unseen, had become a ghost in the desert, untouchable, lethal, and unforgettable. By the following morning, the battlefield had transformed into a landscape of scorched metal and sand-strewn wreckage. 9 German Panzers lay destroyed, their hulks blackened and twisted. Smoke still rose in thin columns where fires smoldered, while the wind swept dust over shattered tracks and scattered debris. British reconnaissance units arriving from nearby positions could scarcely believe the scale of destruction achieved by what reports described simply as one anti-tank gun. Official battlefield reports later confirmed the astonishing feat. Units of the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions recorded losses unmatched in previous engagements of similar sea. Questioning officers on the scene noted the pattern of destruction, tanks disabled from side or rear shots, all occurring within a remarkably confined sector. There was no evidence of multiple guns, only one well-positioned and expertly operated weapon. German survivors' accounts revealed confusion, disorientation, and a sense of being hunted by an unseen enemy. The British command, upon inspecting the site, recognized the ingenuity behind the action. Notes from Brigadier General H. Lumsden indicated that such adaptive use of terrain and dust represented a critical lesson for desert warfare. Standard manuals offered guidance on camouflage and concealment, but few suggested exploiting environmental phenomena as actively as the gunner had done. His improvisation not only saved his life but inflicted maximum damage with minimal resources. The psychological impact on German forces was immediate. The survivors of the destroyed Panzers reported seeing phantom targets and moving shadows through the dust, feeding rumors of multiple concealed anti-tank positions. Rommel, in his operational diary, emphasized the challenge of identifying and neutralizing hidden British gun crews, though he did not know of this specific incident. Still, incidents like this created caution and slowed advances, giving the British Army critical breathing space during an otherwise difficult phase of the Gazala campaign. For the gunner himself, the aftermath was quieter, almost invisible. He had returned to his unit under cover of darkness, weapon repositioned, adrenaline spent but focus intact. His comrades, though initially unaware of the full scale of his action, would soon learn of the destruction he had wrought. Accounts circulated quickly, marking the story as both an example of personal courage and a demonstration of battlefield intelligence. From a tactical perspective, the success of this single gunner highlighted the limitations of conventional doctrine when facing highly adaptable opponents. German forces relied heavily on visual confirmation, coordination, and rapid response. Yet against ingenuity and environmental manipulation, those advantages could be nullified. The dust cloud tactic became an example studied by other British units, forming the basis for small-scale deception operations in the desert. Reports from the field emphasized an unexpected consequence. German morale suffered more than losses alone would suggest. Seeing tanks destroyed seemingly without explanation induced hesitation, disrupted coordination, and forced commanders to rethink the timing and formation of future assaults. The desert, once a neutral battlefield, had been weaponized by one man's acute understanding of its properties. In these early hours following the engagement, the balance of power shifted, if only temporarily. The British forces, battered but inspired, recognized that even in isolation, skillful gunners could change the dynamics of combat. Meanwhile, Rommel's Panzer divisions learned an enduring lesson about the dangers of overconfidence, the need for reconnaissance, and the unpredictable nature of human ingenuity in warfare. As the sun climbed higher, the desert revealed the full extent of the engagement. 9 Panzers lay scattered across the dunes, their armor blackened, turrets shattered, and tracks twisted in the sand. Each vehicle told a story of destruction, a precise application of firepower orchestrated from a single, unseen position. For German crews, the encounter was both humbling and terrifying. They had been outmatched not by numbers or firepower, but by ingenuity. The surviving Panzer units regrouped cautiously. Radio transmissions indicated hesitation, confusion, and a loss of momentum. Orders were repeated, altered, and delayed as commanders attempted to reconcile reports of phantom gun positions. German reconnaissance aircraft, which normally provided clarity, returned with vague sightings, unable to distinguish between reality and illusion in the dust-choked air. In military reports, historians would later note that this hesitation allowed the British to stabilize their lines and reorganize defensive positions along the Gazala corridor. From the British perspective, the engagement became an instant case study in desert warfare. Officers praised the gunner for exploiting both terrain and psychological advantage. Dust, long considered a nuisance, had been weaponized, creating concealment where none had been thought possible. Small units began experimenting with similar methods, blending environmental conditions with tactical patience. Deception became as critical as firepower, and the gunner's actions directly influenced training manuals in subsequent months. The human impact was equally profound. Witnesses described the awe of surviving comrades, astonished at how a single operator had dismantled an armored advance. The gunner's peers, exhausted by days of retreat and firefights, found renewed morale in this act. Tales of the dust cloud gunner spread quickly through the ranks, reinforcing the idea that individual skill and observation could overcome the odds even in the harshest conditions. German accounts later emphasized the psychological toll. Tanks had been lost not in direct confrontation but through unseen, unpredictable action. Officers acknowledged that fear of hidden opposition disrupted coordination, slowed movements, and increased vulnerability to subsequent attacks. Rommel, known for his attention to detail and appreciation for ingenuity, recognized in his operational notes that the desert's unpredictability could no longer be ignored. One gunner, operating with nothing but sand, patience, and precision, had forced adaptations at every level of command. This engagement marked a subtle but significant shift in tactics. The Germans began deploying scouts and flanking units more cautiously, while the British experimented with small-scale deception to mask retreats or amplify perceived strength. The battle itself remained a minor episode in the larger campaign, yet its lessons endured. Environmental mastery, adaptive thinking, and the value of a single skilled operator could outweigh numerical or technological superiority. By nightfall, the desert lay quiet once more. The air still shimmered with residual heat, dust drifting in the fading light. British forces consolidated positions while German units reconsidered the cost of every advance. The gunner, unseen and uncelebrated outside his immediate unit, had achieved something extraordinary. He had turned the desert into both shield and weapon, rewriting the rules of engagement in a single brutal encounter. This act of ingenuity would resonate long after the smoke cleared, illustrating the profound effect one individual could have on a mechanized battlefield. Where armor and firepower failed, observation, patience, and environmental understanding triumphed. It was a testament to the enduring principle that war is as much about perception and adaptation as it is about machines and numbers. The Desertification. T is a harsh teacher. It punishes the careless, humbles the overconfident, and rewards those who understand its rhythms. In the story of the dust cloud gunner, we see not just an act of destruction but an act of intelligence, a fusion of observation, timing, and patience. One man, alone against 9 Panzers, turned the very earth into a tool of survival and strategy. War is often measured in numbers: tanks destroyed, soldiers lost, territory gained. Yet moments like this remind us that human ingenuity can redefine those metrics. The gunner's success did not come from superior technology or overwhelming force. It came from perception, the ability to read the environment, anticipate the enemy, and manipulate what others took for granted. Dust, wind, and heat became allies, and patience became a weapon more lethal than any shell. His actions left more than wreckage. They left lessons in courage, adaptability, and the psychological power of deception. German commanders hesitated, formations faltered, and an entire advance slowed because one man understood what others ignored. In doing so, he demonstrated that warfare is as much about thinking as it is about fighting. In the vast expanse of the desert, the story of the gunner stands as a quiet testament to the human element in mechanized conflict. Machines dominate the battlefield, but vision, ingenuity, and resolve decide the outcome. The dust he raised was more than sand. It was a veil of possibility, showing that even in the most desperate circumstances, one person's action can ripple through history. And as the desert wind settles over the dunes, the memory of that hidden gunner reminds us, survival, strategy, and courage often emerge from the most unassuming of places, leaving marks far deeper than any battlefield scar.